okay, so let me go to the biggest scam of all. And Clyde, I know we're changing topics, but I got to pump the book, okay?
No. Oh, of course. I wanted to ask you about that. I just didn't know how we were going to segue to that.
So I'm just gonna jump right in there. So the biggest scam of them all, the carbon tax. Okay, the biggest scam of them all. And folks, I just wrote a book, April 10th, Axing the Tax: The Rise and Fall of Canada's Carbon Tax. Shameless plug. Okay, so listen to this.
We're going to try to meet. When is it available? First, before you get into
April
it,
10. April 10, folks.
April
you can get it on Amazon.
Is there early access on Amazon?
Right now.
So people can.
Right now. Yeah.
I'll make sure before the end of right after we finish this stream, I'm gonna get a link down in the description.
Oh, amazing!
So people can, because I want you to like actually get lots of sales. Because here's the way Amazon works: if you get lots of sales leading up to it, like a lot of pre-sales, then it gets bumped up to the top seller list, and if it gets up to the top seller list, then it gets pumped out on Amazon as a whole for people who buy lots of books. So let's make sure everybody in the chat, we'll make sure that we get that link out to you.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. But the reason I say it's a scam, okay, is because it has all the elements of big, bad, bossy government, where you had the elites in, I don't want to paint everyone with a broad brush, but you have the elites in the media, elites in taxpayer-funded academia, the elite politicians, the elite government bureaucrats, these laptop activists, forcing ordinary Canadians to pay more for the necessities of life, like driving to work, heating your home, buying groceries, because the carbon tax makes all of that more expensive. Okay. And then they try to tell you that if you care about the environment, you better pay your carbon tax, right? Even though the vast majority of countries don't impose national carbon taxes, all you have to do is look south of the border to see that Washington, D.C., regardless of who occupies the White House, hasn't brought in a carbon tax. Yet they tried to convince Canadians or sell to Canadians that you must pay the carbon tax. But like, folks, a couple things here. Number one, did you guys know that for the most part, the people who brought in carbon taxes never really got consent from the people? Okay, let's start in British Columbia, Clyde, where you are, where in 2008, they brought in the first economy-wide carbon tax. Well, the election just previous to that, the Liberal government at the time made no mention of the carbon tax. Okay.
No.
And then they brought in this carbon tax, and then they told British Columbians two things. Number one, that it would be revenue neutral. Okay. That there would be enough tax cuts to offset the new carbon tax. Within 5-ish years, they broke that promise. And then they started using these like pre-existing tax credits as a way to claim it was revenue neutral, even though some of the tax credits have been around since the 1990s. Okay. So it wasn't revenue neutral. It never was. This revenue neutral claim has always been the wolf in sheep's clothing. And then what did the British Columbian politicians say? Then they said, don't worry, folks, this will reduce emissions by 33% by 2020. Not only did they promise that, they brought in legislation to mandate that. They brought in a law. Well, guess what? You go to the government of BC's own data, and it shows that emissions have gone up. So emissions haven't gone down a little bit, they've gone up, even though they legislated emissions reductions. Okay, so all along, they were never honest with British Columbians. Then you look at Alberta. Okay, nope. The NDP government in Alberta, they never ran on a carbon tax. A couple years after they got elected, they then bring in this carbon tax. You know, thankfully, the next government did away with the provincial carbon tax there with their very first bill. And the same story happened in Ontario with the Wynne government. They ran an election campaign, never ran on a carbon tax, then they brought one in. Okay, and I'm using that to segue to Trudeau and the 2015 election. Clyde, if you look back to 2015, what do you remember from that election? Probably what? Legal weed?
Yeah, right? So it was legal pot. That was the thing, and transparency. We're going to have a more transparent government, and we're also going to be reforming how we vote in our elections.
Right. And if you thought about taxes back in 2015, the one thing you probably would have remembered was a tax cut for middle-class Canadians and those working hard to join the middle class, right? That's probably what you got away from the 2015 election from the Trudeau Liberals. Buried 39 pages into their platform was a very vague mention of some price on carbon and to work with the provinces to reduce emissions. But back in 2015, you had to squint very hard for what became the Trudeau Liberals' signature tax, the carbon tax, right? And like, look, if you were to ask someone in 2015, like, do you care about the environment? Everyone cares about the environment. Everyone wants a better environment. But even the polls showed in the early days of the carbon tax from Trudeau that Canadians couldn't afford even a monthly Netflix subscription and extra taxes. Okay, so Trudeau was never honest with Canadians about the cost of the carbon tax, about what the carbon tax meant, and Trudeau never fully got consent from Canadians, okay? So then fast forward to 2019 election. Well, you'll remember that in 2019, the carbon tax was relatively low. Then it was about 4 cents a liter of gas. And the former environment minister at the time, Catherine McKenna, said they had no intention of continuing to crank up the carbon tax beyond 2022, right? So they misled Canadians again. And then after the election, they announced they're going to keep cranking up the carbon tax, making your life more expensive every single year until 2030 and likely beyond that. So all along the way, even though you had these big politicians, government, media, laptop activists, and even business groups pushing for carbon taxes, they were never open or honest with Canadians about what that meant, ever. Have you ever heard "The king is dead, long live the king"? Right? Yeah. We've all heard that quote. Well, look, what you're seeing from the environmental activists or the carbon tax pushers, they're not ending the carbon tax, right? Right. And this is what Carney's running on. He's not scrapping carbon taxes. He's changing it. They're relabeling it, repackaging it, and they're going for a full strategic retreat on the consumer carbon tax to bring in new forms of carbon taxes by another name, right? So what Carney has done, he set the consumer carbon tax rate to 0. But what he wants to do is he now wants to hammer Canadian businesses with these huge hidden carbon taxes. And then he hopes you won't notice when your life gets more expensive, right? So this book also details the fight ahead against carbon taxes. Whether it's this, hidden carbon tax on business that Carney's running on, but then you also have these international elites, whether it's like groups like the World Economic Forum or, the United Nations or the IMF, or even these media elites internationally are still pushing for carbon taxes on the people. So this book also highlights ways for you not to fall into their trap, because the fight against the carbon tax is not over. And I think this book highlights what you have to be on the lookout for, because also remember, folks, carbon taxes aren't just the carbon tax that you pay at the pumps, right? For example, you've probably heard of the oil and gas cap, right, Clyde? The production cap on oil and gas. Well, how are they going about doing that? Through a cap and trade carbon tax, right? So it's not just about the carbon tax you see. A lot of these different, energy regulation, stranglehold on our economy, a lot of that stuff is actually done through the tool of carbon taxes.
Trish Brew, the 279 super chat says, Franco, will you be doing an audiobook?
Yes, we are working on it. Yep. We have that in the works. Yep.
Great. So, but for the sake of making sure that people get this out there, or, because this is how we're going to make it go even further, get in the chat right now. I have the link for the book. This is how you do it. You do a campaign on a book launch. You get as many people out there to buy pre-purchase copies of the book. So on launch day, it can be way up there on the sellers list. So,
and honestly, everyone, I think you're really going to enjoy this book, because not only does it break down the carbon tax, it shows you why the carbon tax always will be a bad idea for Canada and Canadians. But it just it demolishes so much of the spin that you've heard over the last number of years from the taxpayer funded academics, from the government, from the politicians pushing this. It just demolishes it. Look, also too, though, it's actually, I think, a fun read. It goes into some historical nuggets that I don't think people would have heard about. It also has some of the inside juicy details of some of the politics behind the scenes that hasn't been reported on. So I think it's just a really good book. It's a pretty short read too, and it's written in a style that I think everyone can enjoy. It's less than 130 pages. Yeah, it's 118 pages. You can get through it pretty quickly here, but it's a really fun book. And let me give you another pitch for it, right? Mark Carney wrote a 500-page book praising carbon taxes. Well, here's a better book, folks. Axing the Tax, The Rise and Fall of Canada's Carbon Tax. It's the book that the carbon taxers don't want you to read.